All right, first thing, things are going to be a little different for the last 2 weeks of class. First thing is, pretty much everybody has presented at least twice, okay? I've talked to a couple people who prefer not to present anymore. That's fine. So what we'll do is we really probably won't have a terribly long class meeting today. I'll go ahead and summarize the articles. What I'll do is I'll just say, okay, look through them. When you do, though, here's the context within which you can make sense of them, okay? And we'll go through the 4 assigned readings. We should be able to do that fairly quickly, but if we want to take our time and discuss some of the implications, that's fine as well, okay? And then for next week, the last assignment is going to be a little different. In fact, what I'm going to do, I was going to wait till after class to do this, but you know, I might as well do it before I forget it. And what I'm going to do is make this last assignment visible once I make sure, yes, let's see, have I revised the date? Yes, I have. Okay, because I'm going to give you until the Friday of next week to complete this. And what it is I want you to, it's almost like a comprehensive final, but I don't want you to think of it that way. Instead, what I'm asking you to do is I don't want your opinion. I want your reflections on what you think are, let's say, for example, what are the 2 or 3 most surprising things that you learned about the general discussion of terrorism? Or, you know, what are the 2 or 3 assumptions you already had that were confirmed by our in-class discussions and readings and things like that? In other words, I really want to know from you sort of, I guess, what's the value for you individually in a class like this? And I take these assignments very seriously because I read them and have, as a consequence of that, done a lot in terms of modifying the readings, doing things like the reading notes and a lot of things like that as a consequence of reflective essays that I get from students. So you still will get credit for a written assignment. I would expect that where it's appropriate, you would cite the literature, you know, but for the most part, it is a kind of, again, not just opinion, but really try to write as a scholar, you know, as an informed individual in an intellectual discipline. You know, here's what I've come to realize about this, or here are some things that I had suspected all along were probably true. If we look at these readings, those assumptions are generally borne out. Okay, and I'll give you some examples of that in today's discussion. Does that make sense what I'm asking you to do? Okay. I don't know how many of you have access to the Moodle page right now, but there's a description, there's a prompt and a description there, and the, you know, the final due date and all that. And please, 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 no late assignments, because I want to make sure that I have plenty of time to do grading, because this time of year, I don't know about you, I'm pretty mentally burned out in a good way. It's sort of that leave it all on the field. You know, I work harder at this than you might think, even though I have a lot of fun with it. Most of it's the prep. Most of it's the stuff that happens. I don't know how many of you have ever been in a play, you know, done any theater. The hardest work, I really appreciated the work that actors and directors and stage technicians do before the play is ever seen by anybody. And that's kind of what happens here. A lot of it is sort of behind the scenes stuff. So, but having said that, yeah, I'm ready for this term to end. No, I have enjoyed it. I've enjoyed working with you and everything else, but I'm mentally tired. And, you know, I want to like play some cool board games and play lots of loud guitar. And I figure I'm vaccinated now. It's time for me to go out and disturb people at Oberon's with loud guitar. And if you come by Oberon's and I'm playing there, I will buy you a beer or your beverage of choice. Somebody was asking me, one of my neighbors was asking me, well, do you miss anything from the pandemic? And I said, yeah, playing guitar, playing out with musicians and that interaction. It's one of the few social things that I do, you know, other than this. And this is not really, I mean, we're on screens. All right. So in other words, take a look at that prompt. Don't sweat it, but really, I really am interested in your observations. Again, I don't want you saying, I liked this, I didn't like this, because that's not useful. What I want to know is what's the value of it? And by the way, if your conclusion is, you know, there are so few tangible conclusions to be drawn from this, then I'm left kind of frustrated. That's a fair observation. That's a very fair observation. I just want your honest reflection on the content of the class. Okay. Are there any questions on that generally? I know a lot of you haven't had a chance to look at the prompt yet, but does it make sense more or less what I'm asking you to do? Okay. Because all of you now know enough as a consequence of the past, 8.5 weeks of thinking to have an informed response to that prompt. And that's all I'm looking for. So as a consequence of that, we do not need to meet as a class next week. Okay. But what I'm going to do, all right, I'm going to go ahead and log on as though it were an office hour. Okay. And I'll stay on for about an hour. And if you have concerns or questions or anything like that, anytime during that hour, let's say from 1:30 to 2:30, just you can use the link is still there. I'll leave it live and you can just drop in and say, hey, you know what? I'm doing this essay and, I'm trying this. What do you think or whatever? That's fine. We can absolutely do that. Does that make sense? So let me say it again so that we know, and this is recorded. So if you have any doubts, it's recorded. You are not required to attend class next week. I would rather that you rest and think about this stuff, take care of your other business as well. That next week is going to be frantic for a lot of you. And so I thought this would be an opportunity for, at least with respect to this class, okay, just think a little bit. But I will be available if as a consequence of that thinking, if you want to bounce an idea off me, or you're still not sure about the implications of a reading or something like that, anything like that, where you just want to run an idea by me, okay? Any questions about that? I just want to make sure that you understand what we're doing. All right. The other thing is, if you're not really sure how to calculate your grade, and by the way, no, I have not entered all the Module 4 grades yet because, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but 2 of them were late and I like to grade them all as a cohort. I should have those up by the end of the day today. I've read them through and I probably could have graded them this morning, but I thought, I'm gonna let it sit and look at them one more time. But if you aren't sure and you want an estimate of how you're doing in class as a kind of letter grade, kind of thing, you just kind of want to think about it, that's, just send me an email. I'll let you know where you are. The other thing I would remind you is that particularly if you're really happy with your grade and you've got a sense of what your grade is and you've done the first 4 assignments, I'm going to give you the option of not having to do the last assignment, but you need my permission in an email before that holds, okay? The reason for that is I just want to make sure that I'm being fair to everyone, including people who may not have been able to make it to class today. But that's a little bit different. I normally say, no, you have to attempt all the assignments. This has been kind of a tough term. We lost a week. We've compressed. I think you've responded, heroically, and that's really great. Why not use the word hero? It's overused all the time anyway, especially after this Memorial Day week. I just want to strangle people, but I'm not going to. Instead, if you've done the first 4 assignments and you feel like, I've done my best work on those. If you just want to, send me an email, say, I'm happy with my performance to date. You verify that you've got 4 scores in there. Okay. I can verify what that adds up to or translates to as a letter grade. I will also look at your notes. Some of you might bump your grade up half a step or something. I don't know. Might take a B and make it a B+ or something like that. But I'm happy then to let you off the hook, let you relax, put your energy into finishing up your other classes. We've covered a lot of material in a relatively short period of time. And I'm just thinking beyond this point, how much more can you really retain in fairness? And I do not mean that in a disparaging way. We've covered a lot of dense and often contradictory material. And sometimes students just get very frustrated with that, especially when the weather starts to get hot. So any questions on that? Now, obviously, if you've already missed an assignment and you've discussed it with me and maybe I've given you an amnesty or something, okay, you still have to do that last assignment. But if you've done the first 4 assignments and you want that to count for your grade and you're good to go, then that's fine. If you're not sure and you want to do the 5th assignment anyway, I'm still going to drop whatever the lowest grade is. So if for some reason you tanked the last assignment, I don't know why you would, then it wouldn't hurt your grade. But if you feel like, no, you mean percentage-wise, I'm getting an A and I'm tired, or I'm getting a B and that's better than I thought I would do. I thought I'd get a C. Cool. Enjoy your summer. All right. Any other questions about sort of housekeeping stuff? Okay. Let's look briefly then at these Module 5 readings. And again, you don't have to, in your written assignment, you do in your notes, you want to make notes on these, right? But that shouldn't be too difficult, especially since we're kind of framing them contextually today. But you don't have to include any of these readings in your course reflection essay, it's called, I guess. But that's at your discretion. I would say, in terms of this last essay, play to your strength. You know, invoke the things you understand with the most confidence when you're putting that essay together. Okay, but really don't get a lot of anxiety about it. I really am just more or less interested in hearing how you're thinking out loud about the subject matter. It's valuable to me. All right, so the first one is this essay. It's a very interesting essay from a professor who works for the Rand Corporation. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, okay, military-industrial complex. And indeed, his argument, I would say, is somewhat canted in that direction. He's asking about this tactic of what's called decapitation. He does not literally mean cutting the heads off of terrorists. Okay, what he's talking about is a specific strategy of targeting leadership, particularly targeting leadership for assassination. Okay, now this is problematic, as we'll see in a couple of our other essays, because it has implications ethically, it has implications legally. But the author here, well, he is not obviating those things. What Johnston is saying is, what about its practicality? Does it work? Okay. Now, what he does, it's a very complex essay. If you don't understand, you know, multivariate OLS regression models and stuff like that, and that's fine, I don't expect that you would. He does try to explain his results. I'm going to say, I think for the most part, he's being an honest broker and believes that he is interpreting correctly the data as he presents them. Okay, I don't think he's trying to cheat. I think the data can be interpreted differently, and maybe significantly so. But essentially what he's trying to do is say, when we control for the kind of terrorist organization that we're dealing with, whether or not, for example, it's ideological or identity oriented, and that would include obviously ethnicity and religion, whether or not it's a center seeking or an insurgency trying to acquire territory, whatever the motivations are, and so obviously whatever the tactics are there variations in terms of, well, in some situations, this notion of targeting leadership for elimination might be more effective than others, but overall, is it effective? What he's trying to look at, okay, just to kind of decode this a little bit, is what is the likelihood following a successful decapitation operation of subsequent violent actions by that same group? Is that reduced in a statistically significant way? And the problem is, with a couple problems. One of them is all of his data are pre 9/11. Okay. And again, I understand. I mean, this is a 2012 article, so that's sort of inexcusable. But, oh, hold on. Rachel just showed up. I got to get her in here. So anyway, that's important, obviously, because remember a lot of our arguments about whether or not there is or is not new terrorism, those might affect the results of a study like this. And so he can't account for that, but he is honest enough to say, as a consequence of that, interpret his results with caution. Okay. And when you get down to the conclusion, you can see the conclusions he's trying to draw. But I just wanted to explain to you what he's trying to do. All right, you know, are there differences between the type of terrorist group? There is a theory, for example, that that ideological groups, you know, communist insurgencies, things like that, are easier to disrupt because ideology is not as deeply ingrained as identity, you know, religion, ethnicity, things like that. The reason for that is that an ideological motivation is essentially an intrusion into politics. You know, this is how the world should work in terms of the power structure and the political processes. and the values of politics, but it's really narrowly focused on what we might call political culture. Identity organizations deal with what in ethnic studies are often referred to as primordial ties. That is, we are a people, we have been a people for time out of mind, and as a consequence of that, we are different from you. And that's speculated to be a more enduring motivational tie for insurgencies, terrorist operations, and things like that. It's the same logic that you find when people are discussing the ways of sustaining a military operation, a formal war. That's when people go to war. Obviously, there's a lot more, flag waving and, jingoism, kind of hostility to foreigners and hyper-nationalism and all that. It's what you're trying to do is make of a political fiction, the nation state, something primordial, that somehow there's something peculiar, unique, and historically significant about our identity as Americans. It's even run more deeply, it's the Nazi notion primarily, or the fascist notion of blood and soil. Okay, that those ties that are primordial. It's not just an idea, it's tangible things, blood and soil. Does that make sense? In other words, you see the logic of why that might be the identity insurgency or terrorist organization might be the tougher one to stop or deflect. Okay. His results don't seem to suggest that there's a significant difference, and that matters a lot. That has a lot of implications in terms of our assumptions about the persistence of religious motivations and religion as a mobilizing agent as opposed to ideology. And it surprises people quite a bit when data come out that suggests that ideology is no less an enduring motivational factor, at least with respect to decapitation, than is identity or ethnicity. Any questions about that? Okay. Overall, I would say, and I think it is problematic to interpret his study, which does not mean it's a bad study. It just means the differences are subtle and you can kind of make of this what you want. There are a number of foreign policy, counterterrorism, in quotes, experts, and perhaps they are experts, who would argue that no, decapitation works. Many of these people are the same people who will insist rigorously and vigorously that torture works, that enhanced interrogation yields reliable, actionable intelligence. Okay. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that that is not true. Okay. There is also a lot of evidence to suggest that as a consistent counterterrorism strategy, decapitation is not effective. Okay. Let me remind you of something that most of you, it won't really be in living memory because you're young enough that it won't make sense to you. Right after 9/11, one of the things that came out that was being tossed around, this came out of, I think, intelligence circles. It was a deck of cards. It looked like playing cards. Karen's nodding, she remembers that. And it had pictures, right, of all these are the bad guys. It had pictures of all the bad guys. This is when we really started using the term bad guys, isn't it interesting how puerile we become when we're killing people? How childlike we become, how credulous we become, and how simple in our thinking we become when we're trying to mobilize to kill people. It's really interesting. But anyway, the idea of this was, if we eliminate the people, if we play this deck, right, and win this game, and we will, then we will prevail in the war of Tura will be won by the forces of liberty and honesty and Jesus, Well, of course, none of that happened. Okay. Remember that, Al-Qaeda ebbed and flowed, irrespective of where Osama bin Laden was. It did not require Osama bin Laden's leadership. Indeed, there's a strong body of evidence that Osama bin Laden, other than sort of co-signing on it and saying, good lads, had very little to do with the planning for 9/11. Okay. I don't think anybody knows for sure. One of the things that happened, by the way, with respect to 9/11 is when we went into Afghanistan, okay, magically, we found these massive caches of secret Al-Qaeda documents. Okay, I don't mean to kind of like pull existential rank here, but having worked more than once with intelligence operatives and military intelligence people, or, you know, CIA people who I've known, just, you know, getting around, going to graduate school with spooks and stuff like that. You get a sense after a while of how things work. At that time, there was a professor here, a wonderful guy by the name of Jay Mullen. He was a brilliant history professor. Jay had been, in a previous life, a CIA field operative in East Africa, okay? He had taught Idi Amin's son how to play basketball, right? His job was to get embedded, I think it was at Makerere University, teach classes, make friends, coach the basketball team, and keep an eye on Idi Amin. And every once in a while, get into the offices of his general staff and take photographs and stuff. So Jay was a field operative. He had a lot of that experience. Right after that, when that came out, that all these, I mean, masses of documents had come out that seemed to confirm the administration's view of what Al-Qaeda was and everything else, I went to Jay and I said, Jay, you know, as one spook to a child, does that sound like a spook operation? And his response was, he was a Southern gentleman. He said, well, I know that's what I would have done, and here's how I'd have done it. And he started explaining this, and it was exactly how it was set up. So the problem with trying to figure out sometimes the structure of these organizations, which in turn is important if we're going to analyze the effectiveness of countering them, sometimes we're dealing with a lot of garbage intelligence. The other thing that was happening post 9/11 during the George W. Bush administration was a new agency was set up nominally inside the Pentagon. All that really means is that Pentagon funding paid the salaries of people. And it was set up by Paul Wolfowitz. And it was a committee that was essentially tasked with sifting through available intelligence, much of it from George Tenet and the CIA, to confirm the narrative that already was the justification for invading Iraq. Okay, that's not a good way to get intelligence. The problem with that for in purposes of studies like this was that a lot of the data people are using now I'm not saying this is happening with Johnston, but a lot of these data are a consequence of people kind of sifting the data, cooking the data a little bit. But what I mean by that is actually ignoring data that don't square with your hypothesis, just simply ignoring them. It's the absolute opposite of what good social science is, for example. Okay, that happened a lot. And I am not saying that this was limited to the George W. Bush administration or that it's limited to Republicans or anything else. We know that various administrations at various times have done this. Okay. The problem is, though, when as a scholar, let's say, you're coming in and trying to make sense of these organizations and you're trying to, have a kind of, tree of life of a given organization, it's very hard to do. Okay. So anyway, that's the essential attempt here. The different ways of going about decapitation, eliminating the leadership structure, and the extent to which it is or is not effective. That is, reducing the likelihood of subsequent violent actions by a terrorist organization. Okay, here are a couple of things it can't account for very well. The most significant of those is time. Okay, it should be obvious that organizations have a lifespan. Okay, terrorist organizations are no different. They have a lifespan. And a lot of things can interrupt the lifespan of a terrorist organization. It may not be decapitation in itself, but it may just be, this is not at all uncommon, that there will be a power struggle within the organization that might coincide with a decapitation, but the one may not have caused the other. Now, indeed, it may have done. You eliminate a leader, you create a power vacuum. The other thing it doesn't account for is what is sometimes called the cadre or cell structure of an organization, where, like, this was the Viet Cong, for example. The communist methodology applied to Southeast Asia was, and I'm really simplifying here, usually it was cells of three, okay? And these cells of three were trained to be essentially independently operating triads, okay? Each individual supporting the other two. Why do you think three? To avoid rivalries within the triad, oddly enough. to have, mediating forces, and to enhance the sense of solidarity and camaraderie, and to encourage discussion. All right. The idea, it's the committee structure writ small, very much traditional European style communism. Okay. It worked remarkably well in the field, because whereas in an American platoon, if you can target the radio operator and either the lieutenant or the sergeant in a platoon, you can cripple their ability. Now, oftentimes it depends on the discipline. But as we got deeper into Vietnam, for example, and the troops going over there had less and less actual training and experience, it became much easier to discomfit an American platoon in the field, particularly if you could eliminate the lieutenant. Okay, that's why a lot of the officers in the field, junior, like the NCOs in the field, would not wear insignia, particularly lieutenants. It was sort of screaming to the VC, shoot me, and things like that. Okay, so the idea is a model like this has to take that into account, because if you've got, and we know that, for example, Al-Qaeda did operate like this, that a lot of it was decentralized. Yes, there might be central planners, but in operational terms, each of the individual hijackings was an autonomous operation, right? Remember, there were essentially three, right? There was the plane that hit the towers, another plane hits the towers. I'm sorry, there were four. Then there was the Pentagon. Then there was what was going to be either the White House or the Capitol. That's the one that went down in Pennsylvania. Okay, but you notice that the one that went down in Pennsylvania in no way affected the other three operations. Okay, you see how that, in other words, that de-emphasizes in the field in terms of violent action and the ability to execute that, the significance of central leadership. So just keep that in mind as you're looking through that article. Okay. Any other questions? In other words, I don't want to tell you everything. I mean, I don't want to do your work for you and bore you, but I'm trying to just create a context that you can. All right, good to go on that. All right, related to that is the notion of targeted killing. Okay, and the concern about targeted killing, okay, is, again, does it work? And what are the implications of targeted killing for law enforcement? Okay, because remember, what we don't want, nominally at least in a liberal democracy, small L liberal democracy, what we don't want is a police force that exercises targeted killing. Even if it's a capital crime, we do not want the police becoming the executioners. But with terrorism, if you're using targeted killing, that's what you have. You're essentially using the military or special forces or the CIA as a kind of global, police dragnet, the purpose of which is not to bring people to justice, but to kill them. All right. Now, the examples here are the United States and Israel. I don't know how many of you ever watched the Steven Spielberg movie Munich. Okay, that was a film about the aftermath of the murder of several Israeli athletes in the 1972 Munich Olympics. And Israel went about a prolonged series of targeted killings. And these happened all over the place. Another time when Israel did this, after the Second World War and the formation of the State of Israel, almost immediately. They sent people to Argentina. They sent people to various parts of the world where Nazi leadership had fled. And they captured people and they murdered them at times. Now, the way that some people ended up in Nuremberg was a consequence of that, but some of them were simply killed. Okay. In the case of Munich, there was no concern about we're going to bring these people back to stand trial. It's we're going to kill them. So what this article is trying to get at is, you have the laws of war, for example, as odd as that may seem. How does targeted killing square with the laws of war? Is it an act of war? Is it just like combat? Well, it's really not, because the problem with that is, remember, typically you're talking about, whether you should be or not, typically you're talking about non-state actors, okay? Which means that technically they're not in a state of war against you. They can't be, because they're not embody a nation state. And only nation states can declare war as a legal status. Okay. So one of the things to think, and this is a think piece essentially, that the author wants you to think about is, well, there are no rules of war for targeted assassination. It's assassination. Okay. Another thing is, what if you can agree that terrorism is essentially a crime? It's not an act of war, it's a crime. Well, then what you're doing, again, the concern is that you are using what should be a policing operation to get someone to forced extradition, to bring them back, have them stand trial, and put them in a supermax prison, or if you have a death penalty, execute them. Okay. That's not an assassination because of what's called due process. And so you have the dilemma of these nominal, democratic republics, one linchpin of which is due process, right? Even for the most heinous of criminals, right? And then you're saying, oh, but that doesn't count for these people. Well, why? Why shouldn't it? For example, all right, there was real concern about Guantanamo Bay. And one of the arguable tactical mistakes that Barack Obama made was to swear up and down, essentially, if I'm elected, and now that I'm elected, we're going to shut down Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is still there, and a lot of those people are still in prison. Okay. It's an open question as to whether or not that violates due process, but they're not dead. Okay. And one of the arguments for doing away with that is we can try these people in American courts. We don't need military tribunals. That was an artifact of the Bush administration. And their argument was we cannot try these people in civilian courtrooms. There would just be too much danger. What they forgot is historically, we've done precisely that. We have tried violent anarchists in American courts, found them guilty and executed them. We have tried Islamic terrorists in American courts. The first World Trade Center attempted a bombing in 1993. I believe it was 1993, I'm sorry. We got people who organized that. We tried them, we found them guilty, and we put them in supermax prisons. And they're still there unless they're dead. Okay, so of course we can do that. And the other thing is, the argument is, it shows the integrity of the Democratic Republic. It shows that, no, even in a time of war, even when you are carrying out these heinous acts against civilian populations or whatever you're doing, we're not going to be like you. The rule of law is of central importance to us. A commitment to an ethical legal system where everyone is entitled to due process is a fundamental predicate of American liberal democracy. But if you have targeted assassination, you've just said, you know what, never mind. That's the concern. Now, let me just ask you, that's a fairly provocative thesis. What do you think about that? What's your gut reaction to that, if nothing else?
So I just wanted to say real quick that I was in Cuba in 2016 on a tour, and there were two gentlemen who were convinced that they were going to take a day trip to Guantanamo Bay. And our tour guide was like, well, give your things to your friends because we won't be seeing you again.
When we forget, that is, it's so weird to think that in nominally communist Cuba, there is this territory owned by the United States government where there is the equivalent of nominally, it's not a supermax prison. They used to pretend it was. But very few people escape from Guantanamo, I will say that. And that's because if they get out of the cells, they simply get shot. Yeah. Because it's the military. But you see where I'm going with this? In other words, there's this whole question of due process.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think it definitely keeps it secretive, kind of out of the public eye a bit more. And I think that it does, it brings up this question. I feel like not necessarily subjectivity, but that's kind of what's coming to mind, of just deciding who's a problem, who's not, and we're going to eliminate it in this kind of secretive way. That's not really I don't know where I want to go with the rest of that, but kind of
No,
what's coming to mind
I
with that.
think it's an interesting start though, because one of the implications of that is that if you deny due process, even again, even to, I mean, if you think about like the Nuremberg trials, okay, now were those completely honest, fair brokering? That's impossible. But just when you think of the shock and horror of the Second World War, and then the redoubled shock and horror of, at least for many in the West, the discovery of the death camps and all that, and you think of the hatred that was in the air at that time, and the absolute anguish over the depths to which humanity could descend, and then the solution to that is not targeting people, hunting them down and killing them. It's putting them on trial and giving them the opportunity to explain why they did what they did. That's a commitment to due process and the rule of law. However imperfectly, I'm not trying to make a case for or against the Nuremberg trials, but from the time as a kid that I learned about Nuremberg, I was always astonished that something like that, however imperfect, and its counterpart in Japan could even have taken place. Because in both theaters of operation, there were astonishing atrocities carried out, just absolutely stunning. Things that you would think that, in quotes, civilized people could never do, that were done routinely and that were institutionalized. Okay. And so the idea is, if you get to the point where you simply, as you say, make that a secret thing, it's like, nah, we just won't tell anybody about this. You've already poisoned civil society by doing it. Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, I definitely think that if we were to just abandon like the concept of due process for specific circumstances, it would just ultimately lead to the beginning of the degradation of our core principles and like why we have those core principles as a country and where they've come from. And the fact that a lot of citizens of the United States pride themselves on our Constitution and the constitutional rights that we afford to citizens, but also to people being tried in our country. And so I think it's definitely important that like we maintain the right of due process.
Mm-hmm.
I think even without the moral side, though, due process has like a pragmatic, like this is a check and balance system, right? Like it's a very clear, like this is supposed to be government transparency. If the government decides to act in one way, it must justify that. And then skipping due process is good for no one because it doesn't allow us as a country to determine whether or not an action is just. It only allows the government, or not even the government in some cases, smaller actors, to determine what is justice and what is not justice, which kind of skips the whole thing, right? Like if you have a colonel somewhere making a power play or a decision that has global implications or implications for American citizens, not using the judicial system kind of just means that that whole part of the government that was intended to show us what was going on and to at least bring us into the process a little bit, at least as an observer, we're totally cut out of. So I think for me, it's the secrecy. I think that it's not hard to say that terrorists are in some ways combatants, right? Like in a lot of cases, like that's their violent acts. Like I don't have anything wrong with labeling them similarly as other combatants, but combatants also have protections for the same reasons as anyone else does, right? Like, so skipping due process is, I think, almost more painful for us here than it is for the people who are getting shafted.
Right. Well, what I was suggesting as well, and then I think, Pamela, you might have had something you wanted to say. But if you even think about the horror of Yugoslavia, decades later, there were tribunals put together to prosecute people for that. So it can be done. And what's amazing about that was, as a consequence of that, there wasn't widespread violence. The courts were disrupted by bombings and shootings and things like that. Yeah, the people were behind bulletproof glass and all that, of course, because it's what we do. But yeah, it's the idea that no one's saying, and I think, AJ, you're right, no one's saying, well, we shouldn't prosecute people. Of course not. But again, I mean, we prosecute serial killers, and there's nothing more dangerous than a lone predator in a civil society, because everyone's banking on the protection of the rule of law and the sanctity of their home. And if there are pathological individuals whose routine is to violate that sanctity violently, and it's weird because all through, especially in California, I remember as growing up, from the time I was a little kid, all the way through my 20s, really, there were a number of serial killers in and around the Bay Area. You know, I remember vividly the Zodiac, or Richard Spack, who was the guy, the Night Stalker killer, all of those guys. And there's that idea that even still, it's like, no, we're going to try them and we're going to put them in jail forever. Or we're going to, Charles Manson, we're going to put them in jail forever because we've eliminated the death penalty. Nobody was really concerned about that. Charles Manson didn't get out and hurt anybody. Karen.
I was just going to talk about like the international criminal tribunals in Rwanda. It was more for the closure for the community and for the victim statements. There weren't a lot of people that were actually put in jail as a result of the trials. It was more of a way for victim statements to be heard and for a country to move on. I don't know how effective those were at all. And I don't know how staged those were, but I think that the people who took part felt that that was necessary.
Well, that was it's an ethic of what's sometimes called truth and reconciliation.
Yeah.
They did try to do the same thing in South Africa. I would suggest, that I'm very skeptical about what the ultimate good was of that, but you understand what the alternative could have been. When people are just routinely butchering each other, you've got to start somewhere, I guess. But here we're talking about something different. We're talking about politically motivated people who want to destabilize large, powerful, entities, typically in asymmetrical warfare, not including the states who sponsor them. Okay, but just the aggressors themselves, whether or not, as AJ says, we call them, I think we could call them combatants without recognizing that they're at war. You're still declaring yourself to be in a state of belligerence against the targeted enemy. Well, that sounds like a combatant to me. So the idea there again is that even Guantanamo itself, a program of targeted assassination might simply have killed those people once they were caught. Well, we caught them, cut their heads off. And we know that had they caught us, had the other side been prevailed, that's probably what would have happened. But the concern, one of the themes that's touched upon in the targeted killing article is I think, unfortunately, it's only implied, is there are a number of thinkers who, in one way or another, have expressed the concern that the worst thing that can happen in war is that you prevail, and in order to do so, you become the thing you were fighting. A lot of people were concerned that American military industrialists made us more rather than less like the Nazis, in the sense that we industrialized and militarized our economy, our society, the toys that our children, initially our male children, ultimately all our children, the advertising for war and the military, the exaggerated fusion of professional sports with the military. Those are always a militarizing culture, okay? And they can be extraordinarily pathological, and they can yield some really kind of uncontrollable results at times. Hypernationalism, reactionary politics, and violence. We are a violent people. We are more violent as a routine of our lives than in much of the rest of the so-called civilized world. Okay, a lot of people thought that's a consequence of the way we've gone to war and the way that we've mobilized public support for that war by demonizing anybody, by, for example, declaring communism not merely to be dangerous but to be un-American. That to be a communist means, by definition, you can't possibly be a real American. Well, communism is a political orientation. But, in 1951, people were sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for being communists. Because they were able, thank you, Roy Cohn, to cook up the argument that merely being a communist was advocating the violent overthrow of the United States government, which of course is not true, but it stood up all the way to the Supreme Court, right? So the concern about polluting the judicial system, and AJ was hinting at this, I think, in fact, saying it, I think probably better than I did. That's the one branch of government we really depend on. We know that politicians are going to lie. We know that, presidents are going to deceive us and do things we don't like. We know that Congress is gutless. But we rely on our court system and our system of adjudicating disputes and reaching equitable outcomes. The criminal justice system is the one we can lean into and rely on. if that becomes corrupt, what have we got left? And AJ, I think that's what you were saying. Am I right? Okay, because that's one of the concerns of the author, that, think of the implications of this. Okay. All right. So when you read it, I mean, read it in that context. We're almost done. Very brief book review. Why Torture Doesn't Work, The Neuroscience of Interrogation. It, by the way, is a little dry, but it's an interesting book. And I only borrowed it for a while from somebody and learned a lot from it, and wish I had it and don't. But it was really interesting. The idea here is that, well, let me ask you, all right, without even reading the book review, what would be the argument for, yeah, I mean, if we got, smoke if you got them. If you got to torture people, that's what you got to do. It's war. Is that a fair argument? We're not saying this is business as usual. These people are bent on destroying civilian security. They're not just soldiers. They're dogs of war. They would do this to us. That was often one of the justifications. But again, it gets at that dilemma of war. So that should say more about them than about us. What about the idea of torture? Historically, on the record, the United States has publicly rejected, as a means of intelligence gathering, the use of torture. Now, we know that was done in the field. We know in Vietnam that it was done in the field. We also know what the Vietnamese were doing, the NBA and the Cong. We know what they were doing, but we weren't them. And yet, yes, did we use torture? Yes. If you get the generator from a radio set, right, and it's got, you can get a positive and negative, lead out of that. You connect that to somebody in a vulnerable spot, and you crank that thing, it's going to ruin your day. Okay. But here's the question. Is it going to make you tell the truth?
I think in the first 5 seconds, yes. And then afterwards, I'm going to get really fucking creative.
The problem is, in the first 5 seconds, your main concern is not telling the truth. It's making it stop. So what you're going to do is yell. Okay. That's not actionable intelligence. Yelling, shitting yourself, whatever. I hate to be facetious about this, but you know what I'm saying. I mean, torture is an ugly fucking business. It really is. And what you're not going to get from that. But the idea is, where torture is supposed to work and where the Inquisition got it wrong, it's not the actual torture. It's the anticipation of what it's going to do to you that was supposed to convince people to confess. But we know, for example, throughout history, people have not told the truth. People will confess to anything if they can make pain stop. Anything. Also, we know that there's an extraordinary amount of variability in the pain threshold of individuals. And by the way, it has nothing to do with being macho. One of the magical things about pain is not caring. And if you can put your mind in a place where only a few people can do this, I guess, where you just don't care. Some people will do that in a fight. They just won't stop because in that moment, they don't care. And then after the fight, I've seen this happen with people. I saw it happen once in boxing, of all things, that it was such an astonishing exertion under such physical distress that in the midst of it, guy was fine. As soon as it stopped, he passed out because he went into shock. Okay, that will happen. But you know what that's not? Actionable intelligence. So what part of the argument of this book is that neurologically, our brains are not predicated on the assumption that telling truth is a good thing. They're not. It obviates the idea that conditioning does compel people to lie, okay? That you are trained. If you're in the field, typical training in the CIA, for example, is if you're a field operative, you're given a cover story, okay? You're given an initial denial. Always deny, but deny by appearing to tell the truth. Then you're given a fallback, at least one. Give them something, but don't let it be true. Then you're given, okay, What are the things that are true but insignificant that they can appear to be getting out of it? And the problem is people are trained to do that. If you think about the kind of cult mentality that often prevails in these small insular terrorist organizations, I mean, you're surrounded by people conditioning you, that, you know, this is the enemy, and, you know, they're going to do this, this, and this, but they're, you know, they're going to kill you. So why tell them the truth? If you believe that you're going to die, a lot of times, you know, at the hands of an enemy, that's an incentive not to say anything, or just to make shit up. It's an opportunity for you actually to mess with the enemy. There are a lot of, in other words, neurologically, there are a lot of places your mind can go other than, okay, here's everything you need to know. Another thing that happens is pain can put you in a state of shock. Well, in a state of shock, brain functions start to shut down. You can actually not remember things because you're under such duress, you know. So in other words, there are all kinds of arguments that are summarized in this book. Torture is ineffective or even counter-effective at inducing memory retrieval. And that's what you're looking for with action intelligence. You're tapping into the parts of the brain involved in memory retrieval. The best way to do that is not beat the shit out of somebody, you know, or waterboard them or shock them or whatever, you know, whatever your, you know, weapon of choice is. Okay. And so that's a perspective. Okay. It tends to be a perspective that prevails outside of the military and some within the CIA. There's a kind of, as I understand it at least, there's some tension within the agency in terms of a lot of the field operatives as opposed to the intelligence analysts. And a lot of the analysts are saying, you're giving us garbage. And the field operatives are saying, look at all the stuff we gave you. You wouldn't have gotten that without the use of enhanced interrogation. And then a lot of the analysts are saying, but it's not actionable because we don't know what's true and what's not. Or, you know, part of the notion of torturing people to get information, again, is that variable of time. You never know how much time you have, but never enough. And so you've got to do something to accelerate the process. Hence, you use torture. Okay. But the problem with that is you still have to verify the intelligence you're getting. And if you're getting a lot of gibberish and a lot of people's minds just scatter under that kind of physical duress and mental duress, it's going to take a long time to assemble a narrative. So there are a lot of reasons why people say, analysts in particular will say, don't give us that. It's not what we need. It's not even better. I've actually heard one analyst, at least, I think it was Elise Pond, saying it's not even better than nothing. It can be worse than nothing. All right. And again, it's a point of view. It is a widely shared point of view, but it's only one, and it's there for you to think about. Okay, the last one is one that in particular, I think, you know, we should be thinking about, but I don't think enough Americans do. And it's this notion that inherent in counterterrorism, just as in law enforcement, inherent in that is that for every action taken to prosecute a wrongdoing, there is a truncation of liberty involved. That is, you know, think about things like surveillance, or you think about things like, I mean, that's the big one, but you think about things like some of the positivist arguments for, well, you know, we know that this person's on our radar because he grew a beard, or he reads the Quran, or, you know, she's wearing, you know, Yahaj or something, you know, I mean, whatever, you know, and every one of those things is a contraction of liberty. Okay. And so and it is inevitable. The more secure you are, the less free you are. There is no way around that dilemma at all. Zero. I defy anyone here to explain to me how you can simultaneously maximize freedom and security. Okay. This is why it disturbs me a little bit, and why Memorial Day weekends are always difficult for me. It's nothing to do with not respecting people who make sacrifices. But the idea is that those sacrifices were made to make us freer is really an open debate. We did not invade Afghanistan and invade and occupy Iraq because American freedom wasn't at risk. We didn't. That's just factually incorrect. Never mind that it's the overwhelmingly dominant narrative that everyone's, all your school teachers tell you this and everything else. The problem is it's factually inaccurate. That's not why we did it. Okay, because our individual liberty was not being threatened to any significant degree. There isn't a terrorist organization on the planet that can meaningfully restrict American liberty within the United States. That's nonsense. There's hardly a sovereign government on the planet that can do that. Russia can't do it. They'd love to be able to do that. They hate us. China probably would like to do that, except they want us to keep buying their manufactured goods because China has things we want, unlike Russia. Okay? But they can't do it. But especially these little weak terrorist organizations, first of all, they don't care about America. They care about the American military, and that's it. They don't care about the American people. They don't hate us for our freedoms. They don't, they might think we're decadent and foolish. So do people who grew up in East Germany, because they had the security of social democracy, or whatever you want to call the East German regime, right? But there are people who still look back nostalgically at having grown up behind the Iron Curtain and saying, look, we none of us were completely impoverished. We all had an education, this and that, but again, lots of security, not very much liberty. It's a trade-off that every society has to make. The point of this discussion then is, how is that effective when you inject into everything else, particularly in a liberal democracy, a regime of counterterrorism? What is the price that you pay? Okay. And how do you strike that balance so that you can still claim with justification, we are essentially a free people? Freedom of movement, freedom of employment, again, given skill and ability or whatever, I don't know, however you want to articulate it. Never mind structural racism and structural sexism and everything else, right? Those are significant things but all of that is aggravated. All those limitations on true freedom are circumscribed even more when you impose counterterrorism. And the most pernicious part of that, arguably, is surveillance. Because every fascist society was a surveillance state. You have secret police, you have secret police operations. We've had those in the United States, right? Justified as necessary for anti-communism, read also anti-terrorism, we had COINTELPRO. We had the federal government violating its own laws, really engaging in illegal activities, significant illegal activities, up to and including inciting to murder. Government actions. Okay. What was their justification? Well, communism. Yeah, well then why did you target, whoever, Fred Hampton, or why did you target, the American Communist Party, whatever? Why did you target student groups? Well, because they were communist fronts or communist dupes. Well, no, they weren't. We know the Panthers were not communist dupes, whatever else they were. But what we do know that they were is black. And that was about enough for J. Edgar Hoover. And keep in mind, this is important, we don't talk much about cults of personality in American institutions, but under Hoover, that was in many ways operational, a cult of personality. And in that, I'm not in any way trying to disparage the integrity of the individual agents, but they can only do what they're allowed to do. Okay. And that's the history of the FBI, by the way, is absolutely fascinating in terms of this security liberty dilemma. So that's what this essay is about. It's exploring this notion of the trade-off between security and liberty, but in a little bit different way. Our results show that heightened terrorism threat positively associates with increased support for counterterrorism policies only when people believe these policies are effective security tools. So it means there is some rationality to this, that, the Americans, for example, won't just buy anything. This is largely based on the United States. You had to show us that this is effective. I'm going to suggest that there's a lot of evidence to suggest at least that there's a strong cohort within America who don't care whether or not the stuff actually works or not. They just want it done. I mean, you think about things like voter suppression. That's an impingement on freedom. It's done, and it's supported by people who think it gives them more security. Okay, I mean, that's part of that security freedom dilemma. Somebody tells you you no longer have the freedom to express your political views and vote those political views insofar as you can. When they tell you, no, you can't do that, okay, that's not a free country. To that extent, right? I mean, it's a sliding scale, but you know what I'm saying. That's the concern here. But the idea here, at least at the core of this, the authors are suggesting there is a rationality to this. You've got to show us, if you expect us to give up some of our liberty for surveillance or, other counterterrorism methodologies, you've got to give us some indication that it works. Typically what the government does is just make claims. Nobody knows for sure, but we know that we've stopped at least this number of terrorist incidents. Well, this gets back to, AJ and Pamela's, transparency problem. How do we know that? Well, because the government said so. Really? I mean, come on, it's in the government's interest as an autonomous state to be able to do these things without us being able to stop it, because it makes their job easier. This becomes especially significant if your politics economically lie left of center, and you're saying, well, ultimately, no. The state is about class conflict and managing that class conflict. How do you do that? By disempowering the dissident, by disempowering the dissenter. Well, how do you do that? You declare them to be an enemy. And then when you do that, you can surveil them. You can constrain their liberties. You can imprison them, whatever you want to do. All of these things have occurred at various times in the United States. That's not to disparage the United States, because they've happened in every other country as well. But part of that is so much for American exceptionalism, with respect to that, but also that this is an organic, essential of every society. Every society is deciding through whatever institutional means where that balance point is going to rest between security, the predictability of life, and liberty, the ability to take individual risks and deal with uncertainty. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, what do you think about that? Because this is going to affect your generation, I would argue, even notwithstanding COINTELPRO, even more profoundly than mine, because of the means of surveillance are so much more sophisticated. How many of you are concerned about that, about electronic surveillance or surveillance of your electronic devices and things like that? What can you do about it?
At a day-to-day level, very little. This is one of those, I think, like, this will have to be a long-term campaign to turn things back a little bit. Personally, I'm a little worried, but I'm worried in a level of, it is already this way and there's nothing I can do in my day-to-day to prevent the things that are already going on. Like, there's no technological decision I can make that makes any real impact on how much data the NSA is able to gather on me, for example.
Well, you can use offshore browser, I think Tor browsers and stuff like that to at least make it more difficult. But you're right, ultimately, if those things can be created, they can be cracked.
Yeah.
Right, and any traffic that's going through an ISP, they can just get anytime they want anyway. So no matter what I'm doing on my end, someone else has a record of where I've been. That's just how infrastructure is, unfortunately. And as that continues, it's like very little can be done until there's checks and balances put on things like the Patriot Act or the NSA.
What about the idea, again, this is running a little bit far afield directly of terrorism, but I think, it gets back to that sort of security liberty dilemma. What about the ability of private actors and institutions, private businesses, corporations, to learn so much about you, particularly if you do a lot of your, as most of us do, you do a lot of your purchasing and a lot of your browsing things electronically, and that's all monitored. Does that concern you?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's.
Sorry, go ahead, AJ.
I think it's just the internet is less Wild Westy than it used to be. If you grew up on the
Oh
internet.
no, we're not talking about Wild West.
Well, I'm talking about the relative lawlessness, I guess. The lack.
No, we're not talking about lawlessness. All of this is legal.
Well,
We're talking about, corporations being able to buy data from
Right.
Google that can tell us, they can tell them who we are, so they can induce us to buy more stuff,
Right.
whether we want it or not.
What
It's
I
all
would,
legal.
what I would, I guess, change my statement to being is it is unregulated, because I would argue that lawmakers have not caught up with the internet as a thing. I don't think that lawmakers in general have really followed the internet as it's progressed as quickly as it has. And part of that's just government's meant to be a little slow, right? We've talked about that. There's institutional heat sinks. There's things that slow it down on purpose, right? It's not supposed to be instant and responsive. That's authoritarianism in some ways, right? Like that's what the benefit of that is. But I think that policy is about 15 to 20 years behind the internet in many cases. And part of that just is that, to me, calling it a Wild West is that policy hasn't even attempted to touch most of the things that people are concerned about with the internet right
But again, there could be another reason for that. And it's not that they're behind, it's that this is the United States. This is a country of predatory capitalism. I mean, this is hard-hitting capitalism. Capitalism hits harder in the United States than in any other developed economy. And it takes no prisoners. And why would even Democrats want to do much of that if they don't have to? Because, for all of the humanistic concerns expressed by Democrats with respect to identity politics or whatever, when it comes to capitalism, there's the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, but that's pretty damn small. And the rest of certainly the Joe Biden Democrats have no interest in interrupting capitalism. And ultimately, that would interrupt capitalism. It wouldn't eliminate it, but it would interrupt it. Yeah, AJ.
now. Pamela, I think you're trying to speak. Do you want to go first?
Yeah. That's kind of what I was thinking a bit with it, though this may be very naive, but
Well, we're stretching out a little bit here. That's okay.
no, well, just the thought of because of the nature of what corporations are trying to get at the end of the day and trying to get money, and like from my understanding of it, the idea of why we're kind of in the mess we're in is because people wanted a free product, but it's not really free because these companies want to make money. And I think even just retooling corporations to be like, okay, Facebook is $5 a month now, but we won't sell your, like finding that they're like, nothing really has been free this whole time. You're seeing ads and you're actually purchasing things from these ads. You may be paying more money than if you were paying a couple bucks a month for a particular platform or service. And that potentially if there's like willpower from within, like the buying,
Except that we know there isn't.
there isn't, yeah, but it doesn't really seem like it's going to be regulated from either end at this point.
Yeah, AJ.
I mean, I would argue that the internet is a utility at this point pretty clearly, and that the United States has no problem regulating utilities. Effective regulation is one thing. Clearly, that hasn't always worked out, but at least attempting to regulate utilities has always been within the purview of the United States government. They've never really been afraid to regulate them in some way.
But the problem with that is that's not the problem. The nature of that is that it tends to be cyclical. There will be, a lot of it varies by state.
Right.
But the problem with the internet is it doesn't stop at the state line. In fairness, though, either does the power grid. So your point is worth considering.
I think that as policy catches up, the internet will eventually be recognized as another utility. And as the internet is recognized as a utility, your individual interaction with websites may never change, but your interaction with multiple websites may. So the internet as a grid may become regulated. I don't ever think that there's going to be any real stop, like you mentioned, Professor, on Google tracking you, right? That's always going to be it's a personal company and you agreed to it through an EULA or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But I think that at some level, the ability to sell that and move it around the internet may become more regulated.
Well, there are certainly growing initiatives, and we know that it's happening in the EU. We know that the European Union is, if you can call it, ahead of us. They are, arguably. But again, this is the liberty security argument of that. And one of the reasons for the people who supported Brexit, and Rachel, I'll get to you in just one second, was we don't want to be governed the way Europeans are. We rejected the idea of the caretaker state or the nanny state or the super state or whatever it is. We don't want that. We want to make individual decisions and be individually responsible. And so we reject the European model. Rachel, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not sure if I feel like it's a combination of my somewhat lack of understanding of how data collection works and how it's sold, but also I think the fact that I've grown up in like this very ever-changing world of the internet. Like, I mean, I was born in 2000, so like right at the turn of like everything becoming so much more popular and all of that, that to me, it's not a concern. And I don't know if it's a concern for a lot of people my age that are less connected with exactly what is going on and what it means. And I think that the governmental surveillance and stuff like that is slightly more concerning, but still I wouldn't say it's something that I would ever list as a top concern of mine. I think that it could definitely be bastardized and perverted and used in an incorrect manner. But I wonder, like, what the chief concern with having companies sell your data is.
No, it does not take more paperwork to get a license than a passport. Getting a passport is a much more complicated and expensive proposition. And again, that varies by state. The reason why I mentioned this rather than strictly staying with the terrorism topic is that I wanted to kind of, reinforce the idea that these decisions that we make are not in a vacuum. The decisions we make about terrorism, counterterrorism, and surveillance and all that don't occur in a vacuum. They're articulations of what we value as a culture or as a people. And so that's why I asked the idea, well, what about things like, commercial surveillance? And it is a kind of surveillance or monitoring or whatever it is, or the ability of the NSA to drop in on our phone lines, even though we're not supposed to allow that, but they do. Part of it is, and part of this notion of the trade-off is government by consent, the assumption of government by consent. The thesis here seems to be a variation of government by consent. That is, people are more likely to consent to these nominally counterterrorism policies if they believe them to be effective and legitimate, okay? That is, it would be, in the sense of John Locke, it is reasonable for us to submit to a law that is reasonable, okay? And that then so that consent is informed by reason. And the findings here seem to suggest, not very strongly, I would argue, that there is consent, and that consent is reasonable. That is, we're less likely as a population to consent to things for which we find no reason, okay? And so that's why I asked about just shopping or whatever, anything that in terms of surveillance, the idea of, some people are just not comfortable with their neighbors knowing what they're doing. Other people just don't care. And I think the same thing happens with, part of it, I think, as Rachel suggests, is generational. I think I'm more concerned about it because most of my life was spent when no one had the ability to surveil things as innocuous as what I bought at a store or whatever. And now, let's see, I had to take my social security card, birth certificate, and valid driver's license. Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, but see, again, passports are funny. This is liberty security. Passports are a modern invention. Passports are not old. Passports are not centuries old. The notion of a passport granted by a government and having these strenuous requirements and everything is very modern. It used to be like almost functionally into the 20th century. You could travel abroad just with a letter of permission or something that was very ad hoc. And if you had someone willing to receive you in the country, this is why so many immigrants came to the United States, because they could. They didn't need a passport. Yeah, Pamela.
I almost wonder, with the mention a few different times of kind of like a generational and a cultural argument with this, that like when it even comes to social media, I know that it's not like companies or the government blasting what you're doing on any given moment, but we've grown up in a time where like it's socially acceptable and almost socially expected for you to be constantly broadcasting what you're doing to peer groups and to people on the internet. And I think there's some relative expectations sometimes that we know now, like, oh, if I do something weird in public, a stranger probably saw it, recorded it, and I'm on some random person's Instagram story, or somebody tweeted about this. And that, I think, as we just kind of continue to move forward culturally with that idea that like we should be broadcasting everything we're doing, we're going to kind of care less about that from a security standpoint.
Yeah. Well, there's another component of that a lot of people don't seem to think much about. And it is the extent to which, we do what we do with respect to social media because we live in a culture that's defined by two transcendent institutions. Okay. And it's not religion. Okay. One of them is entertainment and one of them is advertising. And our values are propagated more by entertainment and advertising than by almost anything else. I mean, when you look at the advertising, you can tell by the demographics of who's likely watching a given program on television. And most of you don't watch television in that sense, but I've studied this a lot. It's fascinating to me. I can tell, like when I have the news on, I have Sirius on, right? But what it's doing is taking the audio feed from MSNBC, CNN, Fox, whatever I'm listening to. And then you hear the commercials. They're all for retirees, all of them. And they're for retirees and people who are like these entrepreneurs, meaning they're working out of their living room or their basement or whatever, and they're day trading or whatever. All of the commercials are for that, all of them, right? You go into the evening and you get a slightly different demographic there. But it's that idea that a lot of the values of advertising are a reflection of what we're told we should value, right? We should value, cutthroat capitalism because that's how you win, and it's all about winning. Well, it's not all about winning. I mean, I grew up in a family of losers when it came to that. My old man is a wonderful guy who was a loser going into his 97th year of losing. Capitalism beat the shit out of him in a lot of ways. I should be the most slavering Marxist on the planet because of what I saw, in Marxist terms, capitalism do to people, okay? But I'm not, in part because of the context within which I observed it. I'm trying to reflect on Rachel's notion of generational effect and this notion of culture. The culture within which I observed all this said, if your old man or anybody else fails, it's because they failed. It's not because the system is stacked against them. It's not because he didn't look white enough. It's not because, okay? It's a lot of things, okay? And that's all bullshit, in a sense. But you grew up in a media culture that says you are a product, you are a brand. How many of you hear people refer to their brand? That, by the way, doesn't go back 100 years. It doesn't even go back 10 years. I can remember vividly in the 1980s when people started wearing t-shirts, right? And it wasn't like, it wasn't like Toshiro Mifune. It was like the name of a company or a designer, or having to have designer jeans or designer this or designer. No one gave a shit about that stuff until about the 1980s, because there was the expansion of disposable income among the affluent middle class, and they wanted ways to fob that money off because they weren't paying as much in taxes. So that standard was set by people making more than $500,000 a year, which was a tiny minority of the population. But everybody else bought into it. The idea that, it's like, people shooting each other over Air Jordans or whatever, that kind of shit. That never used to happen. That's a modern phenomenon of a consumer-driven advertising and entertainment culture. Who's Michael Jordan? Well, if you're not part of the entertainment culture of sports, you'd have no idea. So those shoes would have no value. Then why would you shoot somebody for them? We are a weird people in that sense. It reminds me of Borston's conclusion I mentioned several times in other classes, that the United States risks becoming people who can make their illusions so real that they can live inside them. And we've done it. We live inside these illusions. And one of the illusions we have is that American security will never go away. But what I would suggest to you that we're starting to actually exude as a society is an awareness that we can't articulate, that somehow that security is an illusion, in various ways, that it's collapsing. This is why so many people, particularly conservative people, are terrified by Black Lives Matter. Because what that movement and movements like it signify is, you know what? You've been getting away with this for centuries. One way or another, it's going to stop, And so we're starting to see now, relatively rare, but we're starting to see, for example, militia groups composed entirely of African-American men and things like that. It's like, this is something to think about. It's like, no, we want security. White America, or compromising your liberty. Don't come around here with those ideas, because we'll do what you did to us for centuries. We'll shoot you. That's what we'll do. I mean, we could be going in that direction. The strange thing is, it's all becoming the new normal. In a way, I'm being a little hyperbolic. You know me, I like to exaggerate to make a point to stimulate discussion, but think about that. I mean, how many mass shootings have we had in the last week? My God, we're a bloodthirsty people. And no one compares to us. You know, I mean, the most violent society in the industrialized world used to be South Africa under apartheid. Okay, but they're gone. Apartheid's gone. Now, they're still a violent culture. They're violent for the same reasons we are in many ways. Okay, but we are violent. We fetishize violence. We think violence is a great thing. And in a critical mass, I don't mean every one of you or every one of us does, but you know, it's hard for me, for example, to find something to watch, you know, on Amazon Prime or whatever, that isn't violent, you know. And the thing about violence, having seen a lot of real violence, it kind of bores me. It really does. And it's horrible to think it's like, nah, come on, man. This is so cheesy. It's so much worse than that. And it's like, I don't want to, that's not entertaining to me. It's like, although I never liked, like, you know, slasher movies and stuff. It's like, come on, really? That's stupid. Well, you know, all of this stuff impinges upon where we set down in terms of how we personally feel about that, you know, liberty security trade-off. Rachel suggests that part of this is generational. I think you're absolutely right. You know, there will be a part of me, there will be a part of my mind that is still always going to be in the Cold War, because it was all I knew from the time I was a child until I was well into adult life, you know, circa 1993. And it's hard for that generation that grew up in the Cold War to say, okay, yeah, the Soviet Union's dead and stinking. In a way, no, it's not. The worst of it still kind of is there. It's just not very powerful, you know, but it still has nuclear weapons, you know, it still has Putin, it still has a lot of things. All right, anything else? Again, the only point to this discussion is every once in a while, it's nice to open the discussion out and think, where does this sit in terms of what we understand American culture, American values, American generational change? You know, just something to think about. That is all that I have for today, which is should be a, you know, great joy. All right, again, let me repeat. You are not required to come to class next week. The assignment you have is the course reflection essay. And so I will be online for the first hour schedule of class. And if you can't make it then, but for some reason, you know, it's like, look, I got a question, but I can't get there until such and such a time. I don't have anything planned for that time, so I'll be around. So no worries there. If you want to talk about your grade, if you want to, you know, anything else, then I will be available there. And obviously I'm always available for online office hours, but you know, there are a couple of you still, I'm waiting for delayed submissions of assignments and things like that. Just please keep me up to speed on what you're doing so that I know not to give you an F, okay? I don't want to do that. Anything else? Yeah, AJ.
Sorry, I blanked a little bit earlier and didn't write it down, but what was the requirement for not doing the 5th assignment?
If you've done the first 4 assignments and you're happy with that grade, send me an email.
Okay.
And then I will respond. That way, if there's any doubt, I keep emails by file for every class. And
Okay.
so when I get ready to file my grades, if I see that, well, AJ didn't turn in the 5th assignment, I'll be, yeah, I know, but I remember he emailed me, and I'll verify that because I'll look in that file. So you have to work that out with me if you're not going to do the last assignment. And you only have that option if you have completed the first 4 assignments. And that will be your grade. The lowest grade I drop will be the one you don't submit.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Regular system. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Does
Other
that
than that,
quick?
did I interrupt somebody? I'm sorry.
No, I just have a quick question.
Yes.
Does that mean, like, by completed the first 4 assignments, does that mean like wrote a paper for, or does our
Or
speech-
did presentations. No, presentations are assignments too. Those take a lot of preparation. So if you've done an equivalent of, say, 2 presentations, 2 papers, whatever. If you somehow completed 4 assignments, first 4 assignments, and you're happy with that grade, email me, say, you know what, I'm going to take the grade I've got. If you want me to verify that and tell you what your grade would be right now, I can do that. And then once we establish that you've done that by email, that is officially permission of the instructor. If there's ever a problem, you can always say, well, he gave me permission, here's the email to prove it. Okay? Just because I like to be really careful about that in spring term, because then we go into summer and everyone vanishes and we come back in the fall and no one can remember what was done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and are the grades for the most recent one going to be posted like soon so we can?
Oh, that's right. You came in just a little tiny bit late. Yeah, I had to wait for one more assignment. I like to grade them as a cohort. I probably will start grading those as soon as I get offline. I'm going to try and get them posted by tonight. Otherwise, it'll be first thing tomorrow morning, because I think I don't have my calendar up. I think I have another meeting right after this class.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. And again, if you're concerned about it, shoot me an email. If I haven't already graded it, I'll grade it. I'll tell you what score it is. Other than that, it's almost summer. It's gonna be hot. Get some beer, have some fun. I enjoyed this class. The subject matter isn't always very fun, but I enjoyed it. It was a good group of people. I had a good time teaching this class, so I really appreciate the effort that went into this and everything else. And really do have a good summer. How many of you graduated? Well, then I'm not going to see you anymore. Okay, well, good luck. Again, always available if you want a reference or something like that, or you want to talk about grad school or anything else you're going to be doing, employment, always happy to do that. For the rest of you, hopefully I will see you next fall. All right? All right, bye.